that's exactly what we want to focus on in this panel. I understand yesterday you were looking at some of the historical genocides. Just now we were learning about some education programs looking at how we can use history to learn about the root causes and address those today. In this panel, we're looking at where are we today? How far have we come? We want to look at maybe some of the successes, because we have seen progress, but more importantly, we want to look at what's happening today, what are the challenges, and what more needs to be done. We have a very distinguished panel who's going to help us in this reflection, and each of them will speak for between 10 and 15 minutes, and then, like the last session, we'll have some time for you to ask questions. I'll just quickly mention who the panelists are, and then before they speak, I will introduce each one of them a bit more in detail. But our panelists today are Professor Irving Abella, who's a Professor Emeritus of the Department of History at York University. To my immediate right is Mr. David Berger, former member of the House of Commons and former ambassador to Israel. To my left, Ms. Salma Siddiqui, who's head of the Canadian Progressive Muslim Organization. And to my far left, Mr. Arif Bharani, who's a member of Parliament for Parkdale High Park in Toronto, and also the Parliamentary Secretary for Multiculturalism. So please join me in welcoming this panel. So our first speaker is Professor Irving Abella. As I mentioned, he's a professor at the Department of History at York University. He's a member of the Order of Canada, a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and an eminent historian and expert on the Canadian labor movement and the history of Jews in Canada. He's the former chair of Vision TV and president of the Canadian Jewish Congress and the Canadian Historical Association, and he is currently the Schiff Professor of Canadian Jewish History at York University. Please join me in welcoming Professor Abella.
That's an interesting introduction. So thank you very much. I'm delighted to be part of this important conference, and I'd like to thank the organizers for their creativity in putting this together. I'm the historian on the panel, so I'm going to talk about history and its impact on our behavior at the present time. So, none is too many. Let me just tell you the story of None is Too Many first. None is Too Many began totally by accident. I had a student who couldn't get a job many years ago, and so he went to the archives. And from time to time, when he came across an interesting tidbit, he would put it in a plain brown envelope and send it to me. He was my deep throat. And some time ago, I got a letter from him containing two documents. One was dated June 5th, 1939, and it read simply, "Please take us in. You are our last hope. If you say no, you will be signing our death warrant." And it was signed the captain and passengers of the ship St. Louis at Sea. This, of course, was the notorious Voyage of the Damned, a ship full of 1,000 German Jews who had been stripped of everything, of their properties, their homes, their citizenship, and the only thing of value they had was an entry visa to Cuba. And when they arrived in Cuba, the Cuban government lifted that entry visa, refused to let them land, and for the next several days they traveled up and down the North American coast looking for a place to land, sending off telegrams to various countries. All said no. The Americans even sent out a Coast Guard ship to make sure that a passenger did not slip overboard and swim to safety. And the last country that had an opportunity to save the passengers was Canada. And the other item included by my archivist friend, student, which had just been accessioned to the Public Archives of Canada, was a response to the Canadian government, which read very simply, Canada is too small to accept the hundreds of thousands of Jews who wish to leave Europe. The line must be drawn somewhere, permission to land refused. And so these poor souls went back to Europe, where many of them died in the ovens and crematoria of the Third Reich. This was an astonishing story for me. I didn't know anything about Canada's record during the Holocaust. If the country behaved in such a crude manner for this ship, how did it react to others? And so we began to go off to Ottawa with my colleague, Professor Troper, Harold Troper, to see if there was a story. And what is astonishing, this is 1980. What is astonishing is that there had been, in the history of Canada, thousands of books and articles about Canada during the 1930s and 40s, about Canada at war, about Canada in the Depression, about the rise of third parties, but not a word about Canada and refugees, not a word about Canada and Jews, and not a word about how we had behaved during the period 1933 and 48 in responding to the worst refugee crisis in world history to that time. And so we went off to Ottawa and began our research. It was easy to do the research because the Government of Canada and the Department of Immigration did not know the story. And they thought they had done very well. And so they invited us to look at all of their documents, to see materials that had not yet been accessioned. And we went to a warehouse in Ottawa, which had thousands of boxes of the Department of Immigration, which had not yet been accessioned to the Public Archives of Canada. These boxes contained letters, thousands of letters from Jews beside themselves with fear, desperate to get out of Europe. There were letters from scientists and teachers, farmers, bankers, surgeons, exactly the sort of people Canada needed during the 1930s to get out of the Depression. A group of immigrants, the likes of which we had never taken in this country before. This was the cream of European society, desperate to come to Canada. These were letters which had been written not only to the Government of Canada, but to various Jewish organizations in Canada, pleading with the Government of Canada to allow them in. And most contained pictures of their family, including small children and babies. Attached to each of these letters was a response of the Canadian government. The response was, thank you for your interest in Canada. Unfortunately, Canada is not admitting Jews at this time. Please try some other country. And so for the millions of European Jews, there was no other country. And that's how the research began into None is Too Many. And what we discovered shocked us, as it shocked many Canadians. We were all Canadians and proud of our history and proud of our traditions, part of our psyche. And we were all raised at that time with the belief that Canada was a country of immigrants, a country with a long history of welcoming those dispossessed of those proverbial huddled masses yearning to be free. We had been told by our politicians and our teachers that racism, that bigotry, that xenophobia were European or American inventions that had nothing to do with Canada. This was not part of our history. And so when the research we did resulted in None is Too Many, the discovery was, I think, cathartic for many Canadians, that we had the worst record of any immigration country, of any democracy, in accepting the Jews of Europe during the time of the Jewish people's greatest need in the 1930s and 40s. So, the story of None is Too Many is really the story of the old Canada. Canada, up until the 1960s, was a Canada of racism, of anti-Semitism, of bigotry. It was a country that had an immigration policy explicitly written into the immigration policy, was a racist credo that the world would be divided into two, preferred races and non-preferred races. And only the preferred races would be allowed into Canada. And the preferred races were, of course, white, Christian, American, Northern European, followed in descending hit parade order of Central European, Southern European, and Jews. Everybody else was not forbidden, was not allowed into the country. People from Asia, Africa, the islands, Latin America, were explicitly forbidden to come to Canada without a declaration from Cabinet, an order in Council. And that was the Canada of None is Too Many. A Canada that we don't recognize anymore, a Canada that exemplified the racism and white-only policy that impacted on government. And of course, the pariah in Canadian society at that time were the Jews. They were discriminated against, they were despised, they were demeaned, they were in fact the pariahs of Canadian society. And so it was felt to be extremely important by the Canadian government to keep them out. And that was the story of None is Too Many. When we wrote the book, we thought it would have a minimal impact. It would tell us an interesting story of how Canada behaved at one moment of its history. We did not realize that None is Too Many would develop a life of its own, would become a yardstick to measure Canadian immigration and racist policies, that it would become a lesson for Canadians in the 20th and 21st century. And what we discovered as well was that in opening up Canada's doors in the 1970s and 80s, that None is Too Many played an important part. And I'll just give you one example. When the Vietnamese boat people crisis exploded in the 1980s, early 1980s, and this was told to us by the Minister of Immigration at the time, Ron Atke. The Cabinet met to discuss what to do. The television screens are full of pictures and stories of the lot of the Vietnamese immigrants, refugees, put out on boats, pirates attacking them, drowned, ending up in concentration camps. And so when the Canadian cabinet met to discuss whether Canada would have anything to do with these people, Ron Atlee told us that they had two documents in front of them. One was a Gallup poll saying that most Canadians did not want to have anything to do with these boat people. And the other was a chapter of None is Too Many, telling the story of the St. Louis and a previous generation of boat people. And at the end of the discussion, Atlee got up and said that he was not going to go down as the Mackenzie King of the 1980s, as the person who kept these refugees out of Canada, and so Canada opened its doors, took per capita the largest percentage of boat people of any country. And so, in the end, I think the lesson of None is Too Many is that never, at any time, for any reason, should none be too many. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Abella. I think you've really set the stage for this panel in terms of giving us the context and reminding us of where we're coming from as Canadians. To pick up the thread of None is Too Many and how far have we come, our next speaker is Mr. David Berger. David is a Montreal lawyer specializing in immigration, refugee, and citizenship law. He represents clients in applications for permanent and temporary residence. From 1979 to 1994, David Berger was a member of the House of Commons of Canada. And from 1979 to 94, he was a member of House of Commons, and from 95 to 99, he was Canadian Ambassador to Israel and representative to the Palestinian Authority. Please join me in welcoming Mr. David Berger.
Good morning. I think I should thank my colleague Claudia Molina, who is an immigration lawyer and works just 2 doors down the hall from me, because she was originally invited to speak, but she's got a lot on her plate these days, and she suggested me to Naomi Kramer as a stand-in. I hope I do justice to Claudia. It's a privilege to be on a panel with Irving Abella, who I have met many times over the years and read his book, of course. I don't think we've ever been on the same panel before, though. And with Salma Siddiqui and the Member of Parliament, Arif Bharani. In my current career as an immigration and refugee lawyer in private practice, I have successfully represented a number of clients in refugee claims to the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada. The claimants succeeded in demonstrating to the satisfaction of the board that they were, in the words of the 1951 Refugee Convention, persons outside their country of nationality who had a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. I wear another hat relating to refugees these days. I am co-chair of the Syrian Refugee Sponsorship Committee of Temple Emmanuel Beth Shalom Synagogue in Westmount. In the past month, 2 Syrian families we sponsored arrived in Montreal, and our volunteers have been active in a myriad of tasks, from finding housing, registering kids and parents in school and French classes, taking the family shopping, accompanying them to the CLSCs and immigrant settlement agencies, and reviewing budgets with parents. In my remarks today, I will address these two aspects of refugee law and policy. One is the significance of the 1951 Refugee Convention and the need to recommit and re-engage the support of the international community to this key legal treaty. Two, I will speak about the responsibility of wealthy industrialized countries, the Canada of today, including the Canada of today, to help resettle refugees and address the deep imbalance in international support for the world's forcibly displaced. I will also address the responsibility and role of individual citizens in developing and upholding these norms and developing a long-term strategy on mobility and migration. The 1951 Refugee Convention provides a definition of who qualifies as a refugee. I referred to it earlier, and spells out the rights and obligations of host countries and refugees. It has enabled the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the UN Refugee Agency, to help millions of uprooted people to restart their lives in the past 65 years. Today, it remains the cornerstone of refugee protection. It has adapted and endured through 6.5 decades of massive changes, but it faces unprecedented challenges. The cornerstone of the 1951 Convention is the principle of non-refoulement. States party to the Convention agreed not to return refugees to countries where they face serious threats to their lives or freedom. This was a radical departure from the principle that states determined who they would admit to their territory. The Convention was adopted in the aftermath of World War II and the experiences that Irving Abella has just referred to, when state borders mostly were closed to refugees. I'm not a historian, Irving, but I will dwell, if you permit me, in a few words of history. I had the privilege at McGill Law School in 1975 in taking a course in the international protection of human rights from Professor John Humphrey. The convention was, Professor Humphrey, a Canadian, as I think many of you know, wrote the first draft of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and became the first director of the United Nations Human Rights Division. In his retirement, he came back to McGill Law School and taught people like me. The convention was part of, the Refugee Convention was part of what Professor Humphrey described as a revolution in international law. He explained in his memoir that traditional international law governed only the relation between states. Individual men and women were neither subject to its rules nor protected by them, and human rights fell within the exclusive jurisdiction of states. Humphrey observed that the term human rights does not even appear in the Covenant of the League of Nations. But by 1945, the historical context had changed, and references to human rights run through the UN Charter like a golden thread. Humphrey reminded that the human rights provisions of the Charter were largely the result of determined lobbying by non-governmental organizations and individuals at the San Francisco Conference. The United States government invited some 42 private organizations, churches, trade unions, ethnic groups, priest movements, and the like, to send representatives to San Francisco, where they acted as consultants to the U.S. delegation. These people, aided by delegations of some of the smaller countries, conducted a lobby in favor of human rights, for which Professor Humphrey said there is no parallel in the history of the United Nations, and which was responsible for the human rights provisions of the Charter. Humphrey wrote that one very obvious lesson to be drawn from these events is that a determined group of individuals can influence even an international conference. A second lesson is that in matters of human rights, individuals and governments are usually on the opposite sides of the ring. The human rights revolution endures to this day, but global circumstances have changed. In 1951, the UNHCR's caseload was 2.1 million Europeans. By the end of 2015, over 65 million people worldwide were displaced from their homes by conflict and persecution, up from 37 million 10 years ago, and the highest number seen in decades. And in 2015, 86% of all refugees of concern to the UNHCR were in low and middle income countries close to situations of conflict in the Middle East, South Asia, and Africa. Overwhelmingly, the level of international support these countries receive does not correspond to the responsibilities they shoulder or to the needs of the people they admit. Many continue to open their borders and to provide asylum and various forms of support to large numbers of refugees, while often lacking the resources to cope or even to fully meet the needs of their own people. Despite the huge disparities in numbers between the North and South, the movement of refugees to the North has had major political and social repercussions and weakened the commitment of states to provide asylum and uphold the rights of refugees. Many countries have taken measures to restrict access to their territories, reduce the level of rights they provide to refugees, and even prevent them from reaching safety. Some have set up barriers to entry, including arrangements to transfer asylum seekers and refugees to other countries where many of their rights cannot be properly assured. Others have introduced quotas on the number of applicants admitted to asylum procedures or resorted to measures such as the unwarranted detention of asylum seekers, confiscation of assets, increased visa requirements, and interdiction practices. So how should we respond to refugees who attempt to enter our countries? I've heard Professor François Crépeau, McGill Law Professor and UN Special Rapporteur for the Rights of Migrants, address this question several times in the past few years. He eloquently states, mobility is a natural part of human existence. It's in our DNA as a migrating animal species. Realistically, he says, one thing is clear. Due to push and pull factors, stopping migration isn't possible over the long term. People will continue to flee war and persecution until we put an end to war and persecution. François' basic premise is that countries should organize the movement of migrants and refugees rather than attempting to put up barriers to stop them. He believes the global North has the capacity to welcome millions of migrants and refugees, but is facing a crisis of moral and political leadership. He believes a post-crisis vision and positive narrative are needed to get out of this crisis. States need to develop a long-term strategic vision of how their mobility policies will look a generation from now, with precise timelines and accountability benchmarks. We do such strategic planning for policies in energy, the environment, food security, public transit, infrastructures, or industries. Why are we not doing it for mobility and migration policies? Two objectives will be key: developing refugee resettlement programs to serve considerably more refugees than the present 1%, and recognizing our real labor needs and opening up considerably more visa opportunities for migrant workers at all skill levels. François believes, and I agree with him, that the numbers would be entirely manageable with proper selection and organization. On September 19, 2016, the UN General Assembly adopted the New York Declaration, which establishes a 2-year process leading to the adoption in 2018 of the two global compacts one on refugees and one on migration. In June, Francois will propose to the Human Rights Council of the United Nations a 15-year agenda that could start in 2020 and be called the 2035 Agenda on Facilitating Human Mobility. The silver linings, which he refers to, I should take a step back. It appears that the countries of the global north do not support Francois' proposal. But he believes there are several silver linings that suggest that a change in the narrative is underway, and they hark back to Professor Humphrey's observations about the role of a determined group of individuals in effecting change. Francois observes that the change in narrative is being led by artists and writers helping to process changes, non-governmental organizations, faith-based organizations, unions and lawyers trying to protect individual migrants and alter public perceptions, journalists whose stories are helping a new narrative emerge. I just heard one such narrative on CBC radio driving here this morning. The business community, which knows that mobility and diversity are huge factors for innovation and productivity. Courts, tribunals, national human rights institutions, which are often coming down on the side of migrants, reminding everyone that migrants are equal rights holders and should benefit from the rule of law. Cities around the world which have absorbed millions of migrants from the countryside or from abroad. At least in cities, the young are often, not always, much more diverse and mobile than we were at their age, and they share social integration challenges, whatever their background. Hundreds of thousands of citizens have come forward to help individual migrants and families in Europe, in Canada, and elsewhere. And migrants and refugees show an agency, a resilience, and a creativity which is already making an impact on many host society citizens whom they encounter in their everyday life. So the message is that we can all join in this effort to develop a long-term strategic vision on migration and mobility. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. I think it's important to be reminded that the refugee challenge is only growing, and the challenge of none of too many remains. The need for a determined and strategic policy to address the refugee challenges and mobility challenges. But most importantly, thank you for reminding us of John Humphrey's message that a determined group of individuals can make a difference, and that's the role that we all have to play. Our next panelist is Salma Siddiqui. Salma Siddiqui is the head of the Coalition for Progressive Canadian Muslim Organizations. And the Coalition of Progressive Muslim Organizations is an umbrella for progressive Muslim organizations across Canada who uphold Canadian values, especially separation of religion and politics, gender equality, one law for all, freedom of repression, and education against radicalization. Please join me in welcoming Salma Siddiqui.
Thank you. I think I should really declare that neither am I a historian, nor am I a practitioner. So when Honourable Irving Kotler asked me to come to this panel, he invited me to give my experience and my views. So I will touch on immigration, but in a very different level. And I would like to, in the outset, recognize my fellow panelist, Professor Abella, David Berger, and Arif Bharani, whose community is an example of what the immigrant, then the Canadians should be. They are, if I may be allowed to expand on that, Ismaili Muslims under the leadership of His Highness Aga Khan. And like unbelievable stories, and I'm going to be speaking as a Muslim, and that is the best story I can bring. And I'm grateful to Honourable Irving to have given me this honor of bringing my message to you, and I would like the professionals to excuse me if I don't come to their level or maybe unconsciously disagree with them on certain things. So I wish to speak to you in my capacity as an immigrant and as a Muslim Canadian, but not necessarily in that order. We do indeed live in an interesting and turbulent times. The rise of populism and liberal democracies around the world mirrors the rise of militant political Islam. Raoul Wallenberg's humanity and courage in the face of overwhelming odds, saving the lives of tens of thousands, I do believe that we need that kind of courage in our leaders and parliamentarians to break the drift towards competitive identity politics in this country. I first arrived in Canada as a young girl when my father decided that politics of his home country were heading into the wrong direction. My parents came from Pakistan. Its founder, Mr. Jinnah, considered Pakistan a secular state while recognizing its Muslim majority. By the time my family decided to move to Pakistan, Pakistan was moving from being a Muslim country to an Islamic one, a process which was finally completed in the 1970s and 80s with copious amounts of money from the Gulf and export of poisonous and intolerant ideology that has destroyed the country's syncretic Sufi humanism. My father was a man of vision who foresaw these events long before they actually took place. When we arrived in '67, we were among a handful of visible minorities in Ottawa. People who came here because of Canada's openness and tolerance, and as we grew up, we embraced all that Canada had to offer. Unlike today, intercontinental communications were fleeting and expensive, and we were forced, as a matter of course, to interact and get to know our neighbors and make friends among people who didn't share our heritage. My mother, now 93, became an avid hockey fan, not Montreal, hockey fan, and even today doesn't miss a game. We, my sisters and I, may not have been born here, but we became fully integrated into the larger society around us. Just as our neighbors and community welcomed us, we embraced their culture and customs. It was and has been a relationship of mutual respect. I believe that we have had an immigration policy more successful than others of our OECD partners. I see myself as a living proof that one can thrive in Canada regardless of heritage. However, in recent times, two mutually reinforcing trends worry me greatly about the future of our country. The first is that recent times there has an influx in the country of people who see their relationship to Canada as a transitional one. There is often no desire among these groups to reach out to neighbors from other communities, and modern communication technology allow them to lead lives isolated from the broader community around them. A consequence of this is ghettoization of ethnic and religious groups. As a Muslim, I know this group the best, but it is equally true of others. The second is the rise of identity politics linked to these groups. On the other hand, some politicians seek to position themselves as spokesperson or representatives of these groups. On the other hand, the politicians define their politics in opposition of what these groups represent. The recent divisive debate around M103 is a system of such politics. And if many of you have seen the stories in Peel, it is very divisive. The tendency to seek votes in mosques and gurdwaras feed the vicious cycle which empowers the most conservative and regressive elements within these communities while feeding the appetite of populists who abhor all immigrants, especially one that looks like me. The increasing tendency of all political parties to champion the right of one ethnic or religious group when others too face similar problems is not good politics. The divisiveness of Islamophobia debate has opened a schism, which I fear will not be easily bridged. Angus Reid polls numbers on this were particularly instructive. The poll showed our leaders in all parties to be out of touch with the sentiments of Canadians at large. It is not that the majority of Canadians are Islamophobic. Indeed, I believe they are not. Rather, they are fair-minded and look for balance. And if Canadian Muslims feel discrimination, so do others. The First Nations, Sikhs, Hindus, African Canadians, etc. And we have just heard about the Jewish community, what they have faced, and continuous anti-Semitism that we hear about. But the answer is not to single out any one community for special treatment, but to ensure the equality of all Canadians before our laws. The loudest voices in the Muslim community, namely the self-appointed guardians, scream Islamophobia. But Canadian Muslims are not a single-issue community. We too worry about jobs, educations, and social services like other Canadians. Many of us came to Canada because of its tolerant, pluralistic culture and respect for all before the rule of law. The outpouring of public support across the country for the victims of Quebec mosque and their family was Canadian at the finest. When one thinks of genocide, modern Canada doesn't jump to mind, but one needs to be vigilant, and as Canadians, we need to rethink our approach of identity politics. As we know from history, all it takes is a spark for neighbors to turn on neighbors, particularly when identity politics trumps common sense and humanity. As a Canadian Muslim, it concerns me greatly that we, as a community, have allowed the most regressive elements to appropriate our narrative. The constant demand for exception treatment, often rooted in culture of particular parts of Muslim world, rather than in religion itself, is troubling, not least bit because to the Canadians, it smacks of unfairness. Why should public school in a secular system make provision for Friday prayers and sermons? The failure of these groups to be objective and to internalize universal values of rights and freedom and their inability to respect people of other faiths are very problematic. Their failure to condemn acts of violence in the name of Islam with the same enthusiasm as they condemn transgression, real and imagined, against Islam and Muslim reflects on a community at large. And while I may sound facetious, I wonder if one day Muslims and other who look like Muslims might end up in internment camps, as countries on both sides of the Atlantic battle militant Islam and the self-appointed guardians of Muslims in their countries' demands over exceptional treatment. As Professor Irving Abella's famous book, which we have just heard of, and I'm privileged to have read it, None is Too Many, should remind us, ordinary people can cause terrible things to happen. Prejudice, subconscious or otherwise, is dangerous, but when it becomes politicized, we are on a slippery slope. I believe that as Canadians, we need to anchor our approach in universal humanism and a rule of law, which is foundation of modern Canada. We should have no tolerance for identity politics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Salma, for those remarks, which continue our reflection and I think warn us of the dangers of identity politics, which are here with us today, and remind us that we have a responsibility not only to do good, but a responsibility to avoid being part of the problem. It's now my pleasure to introduce Mr. Arif Bharani. After a rewarding 14-year legal career advocating for human rights and access to justice as a constitutional litigator, former Ugandan Asian refugee Arif Bharani became a Member of Parliament for Parkdale High Park and is also the Parliamentary Secretary for Multiculturalism. He has a degree in History and Political Science from McGill University, so there's a Montreal connection, and he completed his LLB at my alma mater, University of Toronto. He's worked on human rights at the Canadian Human Rights Commission, as well as the Commission des droits de la personne et droits de la justice here in Montreal, as well as working on as a trial attorney prosecuting genocide at the United Nations International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, so ideally placed to address us on these issues. Please join me in welcoming Arif Bharani.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be among all of you. It's a pleasure to be with such an incredibly distinguished panel. I have my own set of comments, but there's also some comments I'd like to weave in response to some of what we've heard already. J'aimerais juste d'aborder avec quelques petits mots en français comme une députée parlementaire du gouvernement fédéral. Donc, si vous avez des questions en français, n'hésitez pas à poser les questions. I appreciate this is primarily an Anglophone environment, but I just want to put that out there. I also want to make an important acknowledgement that we are on the traditional territory of the Mohawk First Nation, which is very important in terms of the reconciliation and combating the issues of discrimination which this conference is attempting to address. And I'm primarily here because there's a man up in the second row over here who's burrowed in his notes as per usual, but his name is Irwin Kotler. He's been mentioned. He is a titan in the legal community, a titan in the human rights community, both Canadian and internationally. He is a mentor, an advisor, and a friend. And basically when Irwin says jump, you say, how high, Irwin? So that's largely one of the reasons why I'm here. But I'm also here because I do have a Montreal connection. And it is a strong connection, and I have a very strong affinity for this city and for its various institutions. And I'll do one better than Salma and say, when we first got here, we landed in Longueuil. My dad worked at Murray's Sporting Goods on Peel Street, and his introduction moving away from cricket was to hockey, and his introduction to hockey was seeing the Flying Frenchman at the Forum. So he raised me dutifully in that same vein, which I don't admit very often in Toronto because it gets me into trouble, but I can admit that here. So go Carey Price. But I wanted to talk to you a bit about sort of I'm wearing sort of two hats here. I think the original hat was, I served as a Parliamentary Secretary for Immigration for 14 months, and now I'm serving as the Parliamentary Secretary for Multiculturalism. There's some linkages there that are quite obvious, but I wanted to weave in a bit about both of those roles. But start with a little bit about sort of what brought me here and what brought me to this point. You've heard a bit about my bio. It is as a poli-sci student and then as a trained lawyer. I've worked in my entire adult career in terms of promoting social justice, human rights, and equity, whether that's helping to create a legal clinic in Toronto for people who are South Asian, working here in Vieux-Montréal at the Quebec Human Rights Commission. It's doing work on caste discrimination in India, it's basically been a passion for bridging divides that has informed pretty much everything that I've devoted my career to. And that's largely what prompted me to run for office. And I want to touch on some of what Salma has mentioned in different points of my discussion. But what I saw in 2015 is what prompted me to run. And what I saw was politics of division and identity politics rising to the fore. And I will name a few very choice examples. In this province, we had a very ripe debate about the niqab and its ability to be worn in a citizenship ceremony. We had a barbaric cultural practices hotline. We had 2 tiers of citizenship that were amended into the Citizenship Act, and David Berger could speak to this much more than I because I'm a lawyer but not an immigration lawyer. But that's the first time we ever had different categorizations and classifications for removing citizenship based on people born here or people like me born in Uganda. Those are the kinds of things that actually prompted me to run, because I do agree wholeheartedly that politics of division and identity politics don't have a place in Canada. But I'll come back to this theme a bit later. So I was fortunate enough to be elected by the good voters of the riding of Parkdale High Park, and I was doubly fortunate to have been named by the Prime Minister as the Parliamentary Secretary for Immigration. What does that mean, right? All you guys in the back are like, what exactly is a Parliamentary Secretary? Parliamentary Secretary stands in for a minister, speaks on their behalf in Parliament, attends meetings on their behalf, covers media on their behalf, and is briefed in the same way that they are and assists them in their endeavors. Obviously, the first 14, 15 months of our Parliament, our new Parliament, were pretty busy. We've heard David Berger mention a sponsorship of Syrians. There's a big initiative. There's a lot of stuff on the plate anyways, but there's a big initiative about settling Syrian refugees. I was very honored to do that. You can imagine it was a bit emotional for me to go to airports in Toronto and receive Syrian refugee families and look at small infants and think back. Obviously I couldn't remember, but think and look at those families and see them carrying small infants and note that I, of course, was one of those small infants 43 years earlier at Mirabel, as it was then called. That was significant. That was an emotional roller coaster in some respects, but it was a distinct honor for me to be able to communicate that to those families, that this country and exactly what it represents is that narrative arc that opens up opportunities for individuals and allows them to succeed and maybe one day, lo and behold, be a parliamentarian advocating for the same thing 4 decades later. But I think what was significant for me is that, and you know about the numbers, and you know about there was concerns about how fast things are moving, et cetera. But to dovetail specifically with something that Irving brought up, and whom I respect a great deal, studied with his son at law school, know his wife quite well. She's a pretty important judge. But what dovetails with his work on None is Too Many is that it's amazing to see the process come virtually 180 degrees, because what we heard from groups like, I'm not singling out David Berger's group, but what we heard from groups around the country is, why so slow, McCallum? Why so slow, Virani? Why can't we open up the doors more? And I think that's a sentiment, one, about the policies of the previous government in terms of what we were doing on Syrian refugee resettlement or not doing, but secondarily about a commitment to an ideal that is seeded way back with John Humphreys, a distinguished Canadian and Montrealer, I think he was a Montrealer, at least he taught here, about what Canada can be and how Canada can lead. So instead of hearing that, rhetoric about close these doors, it was rhetoric about let's open them wider, let's facilitate this and make it more robust. So much so that to this day, the sponsorship and private sponsorship model that Canada basically created in the late 1970s, early 1980s for those Vietnamese refugees that either, I can't remember whether it was Irving or David mentioned, is now a model being studied by 9 countries around the world. Again, Canada showing leadership in exporting some best practices. But I think one other thing that I wanted to talk to you about, independent of the Syrians, because everyone thinks about the Syrians in terms of refugees, is something that relates directly to this conference. And that's a different refugee movement which we took action on that came up after the Syrian initiative was under full swing, but resonates with the genocide theme of this conference and its historic conferences. And that's the Yazidi population. So the Yazidi population are a small, very fairly isolated cultural minority whose practices basically render them as infidels for certain people who practice certain branches of Islam. So from the perspective of Daesh, they're deemed as infidels and they've been a target of persecution over centuries. That persecution has ramped up recently, so much so that the United Nations, and you'll note that this is a significant statement when the United Nations makes it, has determined that what is taking place with respect to the Yazidi population in parts of Iraq and northern Syria is indeed a genocide. And this is where my two worlds collided, because as Ian mentioned in terms of my background, I'm not just a parliamentarian, I'm also a former war crimes prosecutor, having worked at the Rwandan War Crimes Tribunal. What that instance taught me above all things is that when genocide is unfolding, it is incumbent on Western nations to show leadership in the international community and to act. I don't think it's very controversial to state that the entire creation of that Western responses to a failure to act contemporaneously to stop the genocide. We all know about Romeo Dallaire's advocacy. We all know about how things unfolded. That being said, I'm distinctly proud that for the first time, the Canadian Parliament in 2016 not only declared a genocide, but actually took steps to act. So the theme you hear in genocide parlance is not none is too many, as Irving's books mention, but is the notion of never again. And what do I mean by that? It's the first time we've coupled something. So there have been historic statements about genocide made by the Canadian Parliament, about Bosnia, about the Ukrainian Holodomor, about the Jewish Holocaust, about Rwanda, and about Armenia. Those are all ex post facto. Sorry, that's very legal. Those are all after the fact. What we did with respect to the Yazidis is we coupled a symbolic declaration, unanimously voted on in Parliament, with a commitment to respond to a UN call to bring in Yazidi who have been suffering persecution and indeed genocide, focused specifically on Yazidi women and children. That to me gives me great comfort that for the first time the Canadian government is coupling a strong declaration with actual action, because it's exactly what we need to be doing. And the numbers are strong. We can have discussions and Q&A about whether the numbers need to be bigger, etc. But I think it demonstrates not only a commitment on the part of the Parliament, but also commitment on our government to couple symbolic declarations with concrete action, because that is what Canadians expect, and that is what the international community expects. And I think as a minor digression, what I wanted to say is that if there's one thing that you should be able to recognize in the current government, the government that I'm a part of, is that we believe in international engagement. We believe in being responsible global citizens, whether that's on the environment, whether that's on funding women's reproductive rights around the planet when those kinds of initiatives are under siege internationally, or whether that is in response to a refugee initiative, whether that's Syria or whether that's with respect to the Yazidis. Now I want to flip to my different role, the Parliamentary Secretary for Multiculturalism. So in that capacity, I'm assisting Minister Jolie, whose riding is, I think, just north of here in Quartier-Ville, and she's the Minister of Canadian Heritage. And multiculturalism is about promoting Canada's cultural diversity, right? We heard from Salma. We know that since 1971, that's been an official policy in Canada. Since 1988, it's been entrenched in statute. And that promotion of Canada's cultural diversity can come under tension and it can ebb and flow. And we've seen that, and I think what Salma touched on demonstrates that. In its benign form, criticism of multiculturalism manifests with the sentiment, okay, we're doing all of these things for perhaps, for example, for newcomers. What are we doing for Canadians who have been here for multiple generations? I think, as David, accurately pointed out, that there is a bit of a false dichotomy there, because people sometimes fail to appreciate the significant contributions that newcomers make to our country. Their educational outcomes and economic outcomes outstrip native-born Canadians within about 7 years of arrival, and their progeny, their children, actually have much higher educational attainments than native-born Canadians, for example. But more importantly, there's a much more pernicious form. Rather than that benign criticism, there's pernicious criticism of multiculturalism and cultural diversity that manifests in blatant politics of division. You heard what I had to say about 2015 and about the nature of that kind of campaign, and believe you me, I come from a very progressive riding in downtown Toronto, but I heard about that stuff at the door as the rhetoric ramped up. And you don't need to look too far right now, and you certainly don't need to look beyond Canada's borders to see similar types of divisive politics being used by people who are vying to be leaders of the official opposition right now in a leadership race that is unfolding. But you've also seen blatant acts of hatred and bigotry. And this can't be underemphasized. And it is not something that is singled out with respect to one community, because what I think is most alarming is that attacks on one community can sometimes beget attacks on wider communities. So we know all about the attack and arson that demolished a mosque in Peterborough. But we also hear attacks that are anti-Semitic in terms of graffiti incidents, desecration of Jewish cemeteries. We hear about turban Sikhs in Alberta being attacked and vilified. We hear about LGBT attacks, as well as anti-black racism at the school boards in the York region. The apex of all of this, obviously, was January 29th of this year, when we had a situation where the Quebec mosque was attacked and 6 people were shot dead as they prayed, because they were in a mosque, because they were praying. In this context, our commitment to multiculturalism and our cultural diversity is tested. And I don't actually think it's pivotal what we call it. I know there's a debate in Quebec about interculturalism versus multiculturalism. I don't want to get into the semantics, which may sound strange as a lawyer, because lawyers tend to love semantics. But I think the bottom line principle is about respecting and promoting diversity and promoting inclusion. And that really needs to be the nub of what we're trying to entrench. And what we're trying to do at a level of as a member of the Government of Canada, we try to do that symbolically, but also in actions. So what's symbolic? Well, your new $10 bill is about to have a black woman on it, a woman who refused to give up her seat in a theater in the 1940s in Nova Scotia because she fought back against racist policies of segregation, Viola Desmond. That's symbolic. Having a cabinet that has two Muslims, 2 Jews, 2 refugees, 4 people who are South Asian, and equal number of women, that's symbolic. Raising the pride flag on Parliament Hill for LGBT communities, that's symbolic. But there's also action. It's Canada's 150th anniversary of Confederation. We're underscoring certain themes as part of that exercise. One of the themes is diversity and inclusion, and a very, very important aspect. And we know that when we talk about diversity and inclusion, the history is not all rosy. Irving has laid that out for us. We know about the history of First Nations individuals. But we want to understand what's happened in the last 150 years and move forward looking ahead at the future 150 years. But there's also important aspects in terms of what we're doing as concrete action in terms of dollars in budgets that help fight discrimination, racism, and prejudice. We have a fund within multiculturalism called the Interaction Fund, which dedicates $5.5 million to doing just that. And in this year of years, given that context which I've laid out, we had 255 applications for $5 million worth of funding. It's basically unprecedented, but I think that demonstrates the need that is out there to combat these issues. We have security infrastructure funding, which has been doubled this year in this year's budget, but that's dedicated to protecting people in places of worship or cultural centers. So the mosque that gets graffitied, the synagogue whose windows gets broken, can actually apply for money to the federal government and say, we want to feel safe and protected in our place of worship. We're trying to facilitate that. But now I want to turn to the Islamophobia motion, and I don't even think it's fair to call it the Islamophobia motion, because I think Salma raised some points which I agree with, but some points which I don't agree with. Motion M103 calls for a committee study, and I'm going to get the sign from Ian in about now, because I've got a timer here because I'm a good litigator. But it's very, very important, so I'm already 14 seconds over. So it's very, very important to understand that that motion calls for a study on systemic racism, religious discrimination, including Islamophobia. I think there's been an intense campaign of misinformation saying, what's up with this government that's focusing in on just one entity, just one religion. That's not what that committee study proposes to do. That's not what this government proposes to do. However, we do feel it is a sign of concrete leadership that when you're dealing with homophobia, you call it homophobia. When you're dealing with anti-Semitism, you call it anti-Semitism. When people get killed in cold blood in a mosque because they're praying and they're Muslim, you call it Islamophobia. And you can't do that. You can't combat that problem without naming it. And that shows leadership not only in this country, but also shows leadership internationally, and we know that the context that we're working in. So where does that leave us? If Ian will give me 40 seconds to wrap up, I just think it leads us to think about tangible aspects, but also thematic aspects. And the tangible aspects is let's look at how that M103 study rolls out and following it. But the thematic aspects are thinking about how Canada can take a leadership role on a macro level, giving the climates that we're seeing in different parts of the planet, how Canada can leverage the leadership it's already shown in terms of John Humphrey's legacies, Irwin Cotler's legacies, the legacy of multiculturalism, and what we're doing in terms of refugee acceptance and open doors, and promote that idea globally, because I think that voice needs to be heard, and I'm eager to hear your voices as well. So thank you very much. I look forward to your questions. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you for being so conscious of the clock, but most importantly, thank you for your remarks. I think it was important, in particular, you reminded us of Canada's tradition of multiculturalism, but also the current dangers that we face, in particular the fact that attacks against one community often are connected to attacks against other communities. And so that we need strong responses. We need leadership at the government level, and we've heard from all the panelists, we need leadership also at individual and at the level of individual level as well as organizations and groups of individuals. So thanks to our panelists for keeping their remarks to the time limits. All of you did a very good job. So that does leave us with time for questions and comments now. I think we have 15 minutes. We have 2 microphones. What I'd ask is if you can line up at the microphones. We'll take 2 or 3 questions at a time, and then we'll ask the panelists to respond. If you're directing your question at a particular panelist, please say that. And please try and keep your questions and comments brief so we can give as many people as possible a chance to participate. So we'll start on the right.
This is addressed to the whole panel, so no one in particular. But a couple of you mentioned there not being any room for identity politics. And the impression I have sometimes is that the failure to celebrate multiculturalism or embed it in our institutions, including our educational institutions, seems to come up in the conversations in identity politics. So I guess I'm wondering, when you say there's no role for that, how are you defining identity politics, and what exactly do you mean?
Thank you. We'll take the next question.
David Berger mentioned Professor Humphrey and what he said about what a small group, determined group can do. Of course, Professor Humphrey was very conscious of a fellow participant in the discussion of the genocide. That was Lemkin, who almost personally imposed the idea of genocide on the United Nations and had the United Nations adopt a convention. So yes, a small group or determined people can do, but these were exceptional people. And I'm just wondering what we can do, or what from our milieu people can come to deal with this problem of refugees. When we talk, Professor Abella spoke about refugees, Jewish refugees. This was from a great power. Nazi Germany was a great power. When Ukrainians fled at the end of the war, during the war, from Stalin, this was again a great power. What we see today is most of the refugees seem to me to be coming from small, middle or small countries, from Asia, from Africa. And the problem, again, I come to what I said yesterday, I think the problem is with United Nations, with the great powers at United Nations. Surely, United Nations, the great powers, could have solved the problem. Yes, we should open the doors wide to refugees, but I think also we should try to prevent these countries from pursuing such policies to force these people to flee and then drown in the Mediterranean or lose their lives otherwise. So I think here again, this is something, what can we do as, citizens of the world to somehow solve this problem?
Thank you. We'll take the third question now, please.
If everybody agrees that the Asadi situation is one of genocide, then I'd like to know exactly what Canada is doing immediately to rectify the slowness in processing, getting these people out, saving their lives. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think we'll ask our panel to respond to those 3 questions, and we'll have time. We'll be first in the second round. So is there anyone who would like to volunteer for start, or can we start at on the right? We have Irving, would you like to start? Or?
Well, maybe you should ask Arif to speak about identity politics. He's the expert on it.
So I'll take those in reverse order. So with respect to the Yazidi, the 452 Yazidis have already come in as of about 3 weeks ago. 1,200 will be here by the end of the year. That's more than any other nation on earth has accepted. So point number 1. Point number 2 is that this is, when you're talking about people who have been sexually traumatized, raped, and victimized, sometimes sold into slavery, the supports that are needed to be put in place are very, very significant. We obviously had some experience with respect to the Syrian refugee resettlement in terms of putting in place supports, particularly for the government-assisted refugees that are different from the privately sponsored refugees. But when you're dealing with a cohort that is this uniquely traumatized, we're making triple sure to ensure that we have the supports in place, which has caused the process to go slower rather than faster. We appreciate that, but we had great witness testimony from the Germans who came forward because up until Canada, they were the only other nation that had extended this kind of welcome to Yazidis, and they cautioned us about moving too quickly. In terms of the second gentleman who mentioned what can be done, I think a number of things can be done. I mean, by people on the street. I think in terms of sort of making sure that people like me hear your voice is one. Not being a bystander when you see sort of the politics of division or discrimination being manifested, but also raising awareness about how the UN could do things better. I think one tangible example, and it dovetails a bit with what David mentioned, is that, I think it was David, but is that in this land of in this global context of mobility, no nation is actually impervious to the movement of people, whether they're separated by land borders or by oceans. Canada is a case in point. We see people crossing the border at Emerson, Manitoba. But one thing that I think that could be learned from what we've done, particularly as it compares to what some other nations have done, is that I'm very proud of the fact, for example, that of the 40,000 Syrian refugees that came in year one, all 40,000 have been given permanent residency. And the reason why I emphasize that is because that puts them on a path of continuity, enables them to put roots down in a community, participate, get their kids educated, find work, become gainfully integrated and employed citizens. By comparison, and I'm very appreciative, and the government is appreciative of what Germany has done under Angela Merkel, but out of the 890,000 people that were accepted into Germany, 45,000 have been given permanent status. That's a huge discrepancy, and that leads to some of the ostracization problems that Salma mentioned in her comments. And in terms of identity politics, I guess different people might have different, I'm not sure where the woman went who asked that question, but there you are. I think you're absolutely right that there is a role, again, I emphasize that inclusion is part of what we're trying to emphasize, whether you call it multiculturalism or put a different moniker on it. And inclusion should mean making efforts to celebrate and encourage people to affirm their cultural identity in various spaces, public and private. So there is I appreciate there can be some tensions. We've had a reasonable accommodation debate in this province under Bouchard-Taylor. Those points being acknowledged, I think the bottom line aspect of making people feel included is critical. It's why I acknowledge our First Nations territory at the outset, because for too long, groups, including the first people on this land, have been excluded for too long.
Well, first of all, I'd like to comment on the Yazidi situation, because as the progressive Muslims, we have been basically following that situation, and we followed it in the previous government's mandate, and there was a lot of talk, but there was not much movement at that time for what we know. The present government has done a great job, and I think Yazidis need more help, and I understand that it has to be a slow process. So I think it's a good process, and we are very happy that Yazidis are being helped, and any group that is would face something like that, they should be helped, and I think we can rest assured that Canada is going to help. So I think we have Arif would have liked my comment on that respecting the present government's effort. However, I disagree with him on the definition of identity politics. It's a huge question. I talk about as a Muslim, okay, because I'm a Muslim, and if I say something to them, I'm talking about myself, okay? So in the Muslim religion, there's no Pope. We are in a secular country. We don't have to go running to the mullahs, who are the main problem. And that's what you see most of the politicians doing. And I would say that all the political parties are to be put to task on that. Where, for what I understand, and can I call you Arif, or should I call you? I didn't take that permission. Arif is explaining it within the context of where he serves, It's not inclusion. And again, I don't get Prime Minister Trudeau to come to a progressive Muslim event, and I must say that we are to be blamed too because we haven't gone and lobbied as much because we are very, like vocally, we are few in numbers. The mosque organizations are large in numbers because they have got money from Saudi Arabia, they have got money from Iran, and they are beating us to that. And we do not need to be inclusive on that kind of politics. We should be inclusive in, Canadian to Canadian, but inclusive just going to the Gurdwaras. They do not represent us. They do not represent the majority. I can say the mosques do not represent the majority Muslims. They are very vocal because they are out there preaching what they want to do. So that is a problem with this inclusion as has been put. So that's what I'm against.
I'd like to invite the other panelists. I'd like to, David, we keep going left to right.
Well, you mentioned the great powers. I left out of my remarks to keep it short, but the UNHCR website currently lists 6 emergencies: Syria, Iraq, South Sudan, Yemen, the Central African Republic, and what they call the Europe situation. In Syria, there are currently 13.5 million people in need, and Syria's regional neighbors currently host more than 4.9 million refugees, making it the world's largest refugee crisis. Turkey alone hosts almost 3 million Syrian refugees. Lebanon has welcomed over 1 million. Jordan, 650,000. Iraq, 233,000. Egypt, 120,000. I mean, these, what we take pales in comparison to these numbers. Since December 2013, the brutal conflict in South Sudan has claimed thousands of lives and driven well over 1 million people from their homes. More than 1.5 million have fled to neighboring countries. Uganda has welcomed the largest number of South Sudanese, almost 800,000, while Sudan welcomed just over 350,000, Ethiopia 286,000, the Democratic Republic of Congo 71,000, and Kenya 62,000. These numbers you can find on the website of the UNHCR. Last year, how to stop these conflicts is, we're not going to be able to discuss that here today. There was a very good talk given, the Raoul Wallenberg lecture given at McGill Law School last year by Professor Harold Coe from Yale, who may have become Secretary of State. Irwin says if Hillary had been elected president. But he put forward a comprehensive plan dealing with Syria, how to perhaps stop the conflict and dealing with human rights questions, ending the war, refugees, safe haven, longer-term humanitarian relief, accountability against Assad and the deep state officials, fighting ISIS. He referred to the Kosovo precedent. You talked about exceptional people. He referred to Richard Holbrooke. There are not many people around like Richard Holbrooke. But again, I just give you a little soupçon of the kind of discussion we have to maybe have about conflicts. But until we put an end to these conflicts, what I was principally talking about was the responsibility of the global North to do more. And that's what I invite people here today to think about and to work on. And I think that's a role where Canada can play a leadership role. I asked Professor Crépeau what Canada's position will be regarding the proposals that he's putting forward to the UN Human Rights Council. And Arif, forgive me, but Francois says that Canada will likely subscribe to the lowest common denominator taken by, the other countries of the global north, and say we're doing what we can and we can't do more. And I really think that, we have to think about the nature of the crisis that we're facing and see if indeed we can do more.
Thank you, David. Irving, would you like?
Let me try to end on a high note. Intolerance is the growth industry of the 21st century. We see it in Europe, Great Britain. We see it certainly to the south. And yet, I think we must take pride in at least the symbolic contributions of the Canadian government. The work of people like Arif and Salma and David in what they're doing in terms of refugees, compared to the rest of the world and compared to what Canada was like, as I talked about before, 40 or 50 years ago, is a remarkable transformation. And so my hope is that given our past, we do have a bedrock fundamentalist veneer of racism going back a century, which we have seemed to overcome. And so I'm confident, given what's happening, what our government is doing, what individuals are doing, that Canada will be the beacon, and has been for the past generation, and we will show the way for other countries in dealing with this catastrophic refugee crisis.
Thank you. I see that we've come to our end of our time. I had cut someone off. Can we take two more questions? How many can we take? We'll take one because I prevented the question, and when we do the responses, we can just give everyone a final word. Sure. If you can keep it brief, please.
Thank you very much for your remarks. My name is Marina Sharp. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in international migration law and policy in the Faculty of Law at McGill University. And I have a couple of questions and a couple of comments. My question is for Mr. Virani. It strikes me that Canada is kind of the last bastion of multiculturalism in the world. It seems that in Europe as well as in the United States, multiculturalism as a value is under threat. And you talked about Canada, the government's commitment to international engagement, and I wonder if there's not a role for Canada to play in promoting multiculturalism with other countries, and if there is that role, and if indeed Canada might already be playing that role, if you could speak to how. I would also just like on the refugee point, because that is what I work on, and I write to my MP so regularly that he has in fact stopped answering my letters, and when his constituency assistant answers the phone, she's like, you again.
So I gotta ask, who's your MP?
Mark Garneau. So given the opportunity, I'm not your constituent, but I would never pass up the opportunity of having a captive member of Parliament before me. I just want to echo what Maître Berger said. I do not think Canada is doing enough. I am currently writing a book on refugee protection in Africa, which is the topic in which I got my PhD. And if you compare the numbers that some African countries are taking, such as Uganda, Ethiopia, Kenya, and South Africa, to the numbers we are taking in Canada, and if you consider the resources of those countries and the resources that we have, I actually think it's shameful, Canada's response. I would like us to see us doing so much more. So I will respectfully disagree with Professor Abella and say that I don't think it's the right approach to take a positive note. I think people who care need to challenge the government in the strongest terms possible to do more, and I think there will be many people who agree with me, and it would be great if the government could give us forums to speak about these issues and have our voices heard. I would love to see a town hall on refugee protection so that the government could really hear us. Thanks very much.
Thank you for that. So maybe we'll go left to right again. We'll give, since the question was mostly directed at Arif, and then everybody can have a chance to give a final comment.
So I'm going to respond to that question. It was Maureen? Marina, I'm sorry, Marina. And, but two prefatory comments. One is that I think it's crystal clear that there is a heterogeneity within Canada, but also within different communities, including the Islamic community. So as Salma and I sit here and agree to disagree on certain issues, I just felt it incumbent for me to respond that I don't think the implication being left on the table that the government of Canada is only listening to certain parts of the Islamic community is fair or justified. The government of Canada is open to listening to all aspects of the Islamic community, but when you have a situation where you've had failures to hear that have led to disastrous consequences in the past, whether that's World War II immigration policies with respect to the Jewish community, whether that's the failure to hear. The failure to hear has led to problems with respect to targeting only specific religious minorities. So this dovetails a bit with what you just asked about, Marina, but the policy of the previous government in respect to Syria was to target for resettlement only religious minorities and not majority Sunni Muslims out of the region. I think that's a consequence of the failure to hear. And I think the failure to hear Sunni Muslim voices right now, particularly in light of what happened at the Quebec City with the mosque shooting, would be an egregious error and omission. In terms of the nature of the crisis and dovetailing with what David raised and also with what you've raised, Marina, I think one of the most useful aspects and one of the most robust conversations that needs to take place is that when we heard those numbers, so you talked about internationally, Marina, David mentioned sort of what Francois is doing at the international stage. When we hear those numbers growing from 2 million decades ago to 60 to 65 million people that are in need of protection internationally, what needs to be drilled down on is that within that cohort, 20 to 30 million of that number are actually internally displaced people. And the very useful definition that David provided us notes, and you'll know as a postdoctoral fellow in this area, is that the definition of a refugee under the Geneva Convention talks about people being outside their country of origin. And if you want to make significant gains, and it's something we've looked at the Immigration Committee, but something that still needs to be fully explored internationally, you need to think about how the international community can come up with a robust response to people that are internally displaced and not outside their country of origin. Because it also feeds the delay on the Yazidi resettlement that somebody raised, because it's very difficult for us to go into Iraq and take out Iraqi nationals because you have issues of geopolitics and state sovereignty that are involved. It's much easier to take out a Yazidi who's crossed from Iraq into Syria. So I throw that out there. And I take your point that better is always possible. I mean, the Prime Minister says that all the time. I do note that the policies that we've implemented and the leadership we've shown are a fourfold increase on every category and stream from the previous government. So that's a gigantic increase numerically in terms of what Canada is doing. Could more be done? Yes, more could be done. Should there be more opportunities for people to have town halls on particular areas? Absolutely. And I will communicate to Mark that I heard from one of his constituents here in Montreal. Thank you. Two of his constituents.
Well, I just heard from Arif. We do agree to disagree, but I will take him on and I will be calling his office to see how he can arrange a meeting with us, and I would welcome that. Yes, no, I need your card. You will not, I will have a Marc Garneau situation then.
There's the card.
Thank you. And you'll remember my name. Thank you. Then I'm not going to comment on
I'm going to be seeing Marc Garneau in a few weeks also with my colleague and law partner, Mitchell Goldberg, to talk about immigration and refugee matters. But I would like to commend Arif and the government. I think they mean well, and they're doing well. And I appreciate him being here today. I think we all do. And I think that Francois is onto something, and I'd like I'd like to see this dialogue continue. I'd like to see how the government can support him in his efforts in the months to come.
Thanks. I do wish our government would do more. On the other hand, I've spent much of the past year in the United States at several universities. And when I see that the major complaint of Canadians is that the process isn't working fast enough, that the family adoption program is too slow compared to what's going on in America, my heart leaps. Canada is a paragon. Canada is something that people keep asking their own country to model themselves on. So I wouldn't be that critical. I think Arif and his colleagues are doing very well so far. We should keep a watching brief on them, but I think Canada has much to be proud of.
So in wrapping up this panel, just to say I think all of us as individual citizens have a role to play in making sure our government does do more. So I encourage us to play that role. And I want you all to join me in thanking our wonderful panel for helping us with this discussion and reflection today. Thank you.
I would like to welcome everybody for lunch. It's in F216, our boardroom. So all of our panelists are welcome to stay for lunch. And certainly if you've registered for lunch, please join us as well in F216. Thank you. Bye-bye.